Dawn of War 4 is starting to sound exactly like the kind of comeback that longtime fans of the franchise have been hoping for. Between the recent PC Gamer write-up and the Deep Strike interview with King Art Games senior game designer Elliot Verbiest, we've now got a much better idea of what this game is trying to be. And honestly, it sounds like the developers really understand why people loved Dawn of War in the first place. The big headline is probably the combat. Apparently, during the closed alpha playtests, one of the standout pieces of feedback wasn't that battles were too chaotic, too slow, or too hard to read. In fact, it was basically the opposite. Players were asking if combat could actually last a little longer, mostly so they could spend more time watching it. Now, a big reason for that is because Dawn of War 4 is leaning hard into sync kills and synchronized melee combat. If you played the older games, especially the first Dawn of War, you'll remember how satisfying those brutal close-range animations could really be. But this time, King Art Games seems to be pushing that idea much further, with a system designed to make melee combat feel more cinematic and more coordinated across the battlefield. And honestly, this is saying a lot if your playtesters are asking for longer fights because they are just having so much fun watching the carnage. You've probably done something very right with regards to combat. But what's really interesting is that Dawn of War 4 doesn't just seem to be chasing a spectacle for the sake of it. The developers keep talking about wanting to capture the feeling of Warhammer 40k and not just copy mechanics directly from the tabletop. And that in fact seems to be one of the main design goals here. They want Space Marines to feel like Space Marines. Elite, powerful, devastating, but they can't be everywhere at once. They want orcs to feel like a proper green tide, spreading across the map and becoming more dangerous as the battle goes on. Essentially, they clearly want each faction to naturally play in a way that matches their characteristics. This approach also explains how they are handling balance, especially the difference between campaign and multiplayer. According to Verbiest, the campaign is where they really let the fantasy run wild. The idea is that whichever faction you are playing should feel like the coolest one in the universe at that moment. Multiplayer game modes, though, is a different story. That is essentially where fairness matters more, and where some tabletop or lore-accurate ideas need to be adapted so that they do not become a nightmare to play against. The Necrons are a perfect example of that. In the interview, it was mentioned that in a more cinematic single-player setting, bringing dead units back can feel amazing. In competitive multiplayer though, that kind of mechanic can easily feel like an annoying undo button. So instead of directly copying the Resurrection Orb, the developers created something called the Resurrection Gallery. It's a Necron structure that lets certain units come back after they die, but not instantly. There's a delay and your opponent can counter it, so the faction still keeps that identity of not staying dead, but now there is actually room for some counterplay. That feels like a smart compromise, and it shows that they are trying to preserve the characteristics of the factions without wrecking balance. The same logic will be applying to one of the biggest reveals for Dawn of War 4, which is the presence of Lion L. Jonson as a playable Primarch. Yes, that's right, as many of you will know, but some of you may not, the Primarch of the Dark Angels is going to appear in Dawn of War 4. That is obviously a huge deal, especially because this is effectively his video game debut. But of course, he won't be playable in multiplayer, which makes a lot of sense. As Verbiest put it, there's just no real way to make Lionel Jonson feel both fun and lore accurate in a competitive match. So instead, Lionel Jonson appears as a major campaign moment, something powerful, rare and memorable rather than just another unit to spam online. Well, I guess you can't really get more than one Lionel Jonson, but you get my drift. Speaking of the campaign though, Dawn of War 4 is going back to Cronus, which is a really nice nod for the fans of Dark Crusade. The developers said that they wanted a single planet setting, and Cronus stood out because it is familiar, recognizable, and of course closely tied to the kind of Dawn of War nostalgia that they are aiming for. That nostalgia is clearly shaping a lot of the project. In fact, Verbiest outright says that Dawn of War 1 was their magnetic north, which to me tells us that they are likely to pull back towards large-scale battles, classic base building, and the kind of battlefield identity that a lot of fans felt the series moved away from over time. Now that doesn't mean that they are ignoring the later games though. They also mentioned bringing back the Last Stand game mode from Dawn of War 2 for the launch of Dawn of War 4. For me, this is an incredibly smart move. It brings a multiplayer game mode, but cooperative and more social and a lot more chilled than the sweaty multiplayer 1v1 game mode. I genuinely think that this is going to be the most popular game mode for Dawn of War 4 after the campaign. In total, Dawn of War 4 for me doesn't sound like a total reset. In fact, it sounds more like a deliberate attempt to take the best parts of games from across the series and rebuild Dawn of War around the strongest ideas. Faction-wise, the current lineup sounds strong too. You've got the Space Marines, Orcs, Necrons, and Adeptus Mechanicus. Now I'm sure there's many of you who would love to see more factions, and I would think that they would come in the future as well, possibly as DLCs. Either way, the Mechanicus are especially interesting because they've never really been a full faction in a Dawn of War game before, at least not officially. But they are, however, still pretty recognizable within the Warhammer 40k universe, enough to feel like a natural fit. According to the developers, they wanted one faction that felt fresh while still being familiar to Warhammer fans, and Mechanicus, apparently for them, hit that sweet spot. But what do you think? Do you think this was a nice inclusion, or would you have preferred to see a different faction? A bit of a spicy question. I'm sure a lot of you will have some strong opinions. Let me know in the comment section below. In any case, there are also some nice details that make the whole project feel like it's being made by people who genuinely care about the setting. Verbiest talks about paying close attention to scale, environmental details, and even tabletop kits as visual inspiration. He mentions things like the Munitorum crates and recognizable scenery pieces, which suggests that the developers are trying to make the world itself feel authentically 40k, not just the units. And maybe the most reassuring thing from the whole interview is that this really does sound like a passion project. The team already had regular miniature painting sessions before they were even working on Dawn of War 4, and they've apparently got display cases full of models in the studio. In fact, we have seen it in some previous developer interviews. Now of course that far from guarantees that the game will automatically be great, obviously, but it does help explain why so much of what they are saying sounds like it's coming from actual fans instead of a marketing checklist. So overall, Dawn of War 4 is sounding like a game that wants to bring back the scale, the faction characteristics, and sheer spectacle that made older games memorable, while also being a bit smarter about balance and modern RTS design. It's still early, of course, and there's obviously a lot we haven't yet seen, but the direction sounds very, very promising. If King Art Games can really deliver that Dawn of War 1 energy, bring back those massive battles, and make the combat as satisfying to watch as playtesters are saying, then this could end up being a seriously exciting return for the series. And honestly, in a Warhammer game, hearing that players want battles to last longer just so that they can watch more sync kills is probably one of the biggest signs that we could ask for of this game being a real hit. I would like to say a very big thank you to everyone who's been supporting the channel. If you've been enjoying the videos, make sure you give this one a thumbs up. But perhaps more importantly, make sure that you are subscribed and you've hit the notification bell. I really appreciate the support. Take care and see you next time.